This is London, a city packed with wealth, over 200,000 millionaires, hundreds of centimillionaires, and dozens of billionaires. London glitters, but the rest of the UK? Not even close. Across much of the country, people have less disposable income than the poorest US states, and even trail behind the average OECD nation. And if you take London and the Southeast out of the equation, the UK's GDP per person plunges by nearly 14%. In some parts of Blackpool, life expectancy falls below that of Rwanda. Entire towns that once powered the empire now rank among the poorest in Western Europe. A nation that once ruled the world now struggles to take care of its own people. How did this happen? This is the story of a country divided. Our journey begins in 1979. Margaret Thatcher takes office as Prime Minister, determined to crush inflation. And she needed to, because throughout the 1970s, prices had spiraled completely out of control. £100 in 1970 was worth over £300 just 9 years later. But what caused this chaos? First came the twin oil shocks. OPEC doubled, then tripled global oil prices. Overnight, everything from fuel to food jumped in cost. At the same time, trade unions flexed extraordinary power, demanding higher and higher wages to keep up with rising prices. That fed a relentless cycle. Prices surged, wages surged, prices surged again. Add in loose monetary policy and government overspending, and the UK was drowning in excess money. Thatcher, backed by Chancellor Geoffrey Howe and monetarists like Keith Joseph and Alan Walters, declared war on inflation. Her plan had 3 pillars. First, shrink the money supply. Sterling M3 growth was slashed from roughly 12% annually to about 6% by 1984. Second, push interest rates to brutal heights. Just months into her term, rates jumped from 12% to 14%. By November, they hit 17%, the highest in British history. The logic was simple: make borrowing painful, slow down credit, and starve inflation to death. But these moves had consequences. A surging pound made UK exports expensive abroad, and sky-high borrowing costs crippled small businesses. Manufacturers couldn't modernize, couldn't expand, and many couldn't survive at all. Third, cut government spending. Thatcher aimed to slash the public sector borrowing requirement from 4.7% of GDP in 1979 to roughly 1.5% by 1983. And in the middle of a recession, her government even raised taxes, a move so shocking that over 360 economists signed a public letter calling the policy baseless and dangerous. But did her plan work? Technically, yes. Inflation plunged from 13% in 1979 to around 5% by 1983. But the cost? Devastating. High interest rates, a strong pound, and deep spending cuts crushed industrial towns across the UK. Factories closed, entire communities were hollowed out. Regional inequality began to harden into a permanent reality. Meanwhile, London lived a different life. Powered by finance and services, the capital weathered the storm. By the mid-1980s, unemployment in northern England, Scotland, and Wales surged past 15%. Yet London and the Southeast stayed under 10%. Why? Because London was about to undergo a transformation that changed the entire country.
Enter the Big Bang, the sweeping deregulation package that reshaped London forever. Thatcher wanted the capital to become a global financial powerhouse, so she tore down old rules. Fixed commissions were eliminated, exchange controls vanished, the single capacity rule ended, foreign ownership was welcomed, and electronic trading exploded onto the scene. The result? International banks flooded in with nearly £500 million. thousands of new millionaires were minted, and London cemented itself as the world's leading financial hub. On paper, the UK looked like it had been reborn. When Thatcher arrived in 1979, GDP sat around £1 trillion. By the time she left in 1990, it had risen to roughly £1.4 trillion. GDP per capita jumped as well, from around £15,500 to nearly £19,900. Britain looked richer. But numbers can hide uncomfortable truths. During those same years, the Gini coefficient, a measure of inequality, soared from 25 to 35. GDP rose 30%. Inequality rose almost 40%. So yes, Britain was becoming wealthier, but the gains were pooled into fewer and fewer hands. A major part of this inequality came from the collapse of Britain's industrial backbone. Manufacturing contributed nearly 30% of GDP in 1979. By 1990, that share fell to about 16%. Manufacturing employment dropped nearly 40% between 1979 and 1993. So while the country looked prosperous on spreadsheets, if you didn't live in London, you probably didn't feel any of it. Services grew, finance exploded, but the industries that once employed millions were shrinking fast. Another way to understand the impact is through the difference between direct and indirect job creation. If you open a factory, you might hire 100 workers directly, but that factory depends on steel suppliers, electricity, distributors, creating perhaps 300 more jobs indirectly, a ratio of 1 to 3. Banking? Roughly 200 indirect jobs for every 100 direct ones, a 1 to 2 ratio. Iron manufacturing? 900 indirect jobs for every 100 direct, a staggering 1 to 9 ratio. Financial services as a whole sit near 1 to 3.6. Sounds decent until you compare it to utilities, durable manufacturing, and non-durable manufacturing, all of which support broader, thicker job networks. This is one reason service-heavy economies produce high GDP, but also high inequality. Wealth concentrates while fewer people benefit across the wider region. And it's not just job numbers, it's job quality. Manufacturing roles historically came with pensions, medical coverage, paid leave, and long-term stability. But the service sector alternatives, especially for low-skilled workers, rarely provided those protections. Research shows that the shift away from manufacturing directly contributed to widening inequality. And because manufacturing in the UK was heavily clustered in specific areas, the impact was brutally uneven. London thrived, the rest of the country weakened. Today, not a single region north of London has a GDP per capita above the UK average. Every region, except London and the Southeast, is poorer than the national mean. Think about that. As economic gaps widened, you'd expect people to move toward London in huge waves, just like they do in other countries. But something strange happened. Even though people in the UK move between regions more frequently than citizens of most G7 countries, London is the exception. More Britons leave London than move into it. Why? Because life in London is expensive, brutally so. Median household income might be 14% higher than the UK average, but once you factor in housing, that advantage shrinks to basically nothing. Just 1%. Unless you're in the top quarter of earners, moving to London makes no financial sense. Housing costs in the capital are nearly double the UK average, and for what you actually get, the price feels even worse. It's no surprise London faces a homelessness crisis unlike any other Western city. In 2024, over 13,000 people were recorded as sleeping rough, a 10% increase from the previous year, and a 63% rise over a decade. Roughly 2% of Londoners are considered homeless. New York, sits at 0.8%, Toronto 0.5%, Paris 0.3%, Berlin 0.3%, Amsterdam 0.2%. London's problem is on another level. One major driver dates back to 1980. The right to buy scheme. Thatcher allowed social housing tenants to buy their homes at steep discounts, initially 33% for houses, 50% for flats, later rising to as high as 70%. Local councils were pushed to offer mortgages with zero deposits. People could buy a home far below market price, sell later at full value, and pocket the profit tax-free. Great for that generation, terrible for every generation after. London suffered the most. Back in 1980, the city had around 715,000 social housing units, nearly a third of its housing stock. Today, only about 390,000 remain, a collapse of over 60%. Across the UK, at least 40% of former right-to-buy homes are now rented at full market rates. And London's housing crisis doesn't end there. The city places almost no restrictions on foreign buyers. Millionaires and billionaires from abroad face zero barriers to purchasing property, and they do so eagerly. In early 2024, nearly 27% of residential property sales went to foreign buyers. New York, by comparison, sits around 0.3%, a 90-fold difference. Over 20% of new rental developments in London now have at least one foreign shareholder, double the level from 2016. The reason is simple: the UK's now defunct non-dom tax policy. Foreign residents could claim their permanent home was elsewhere and avoid paying UK tax on overseas income or capital gains. Yes, these people spend money in Britain, but they also inflate housing demand without contributing proportionately to the economy. They don't build businesses, they don't expand local employment, they don't staff hospitals or factories. They just buy luxury homes, dine, shop, and leave the rest of the city to deal with soaring prices. Housing is only the beginning. The real story is where Britain chooses to spend its money. And for decades, the answer has been simple: London.
When people complain about London's transport system, the delays, the crowded tube, the aging infrastructure, it's clear they haven't traveled much outside the capital, because compared to the rest of the country, London is living in another world. Look at transport investment per person. London receives nearly £1,200. The Northeast gets around £430. The East Midlands, just £350. Even the Southeast, right next door, gets less than half of London's share. To put it into perspective, if Northern England had been funded at the same per-person rate as London, it would have received an additional £140 billion. That's the equivalent of building 7 more Elizabeth lines. And the bigger issue? The UK already underinvests in transport compared to its peers. Between 1995 and 2020, Britain poured only 0.3% of GDP annually into road infrastructure. Italy spent 0.4%. Germany and the US sat at 0.5%. France invested over 0.6%. That chronic underspending has real consequences. Cities outside London become less productive. Weak transport links shrink effective city size. Fewer people can commute. Fewer businesses can connect, and economic growth gets throttled. A striking data point captures the whole problem. The UK is almost the only place in Western Europe where the size of a city does not strongly correlate with how economically productive it is. Poor infrastructure is a major reason why. And transport isn't the only sector starved of cash. Research and development spending follows the same pattern. Public R&D investment is overwhelmingly concentrated in places that are already rich, especially London. In 2016, government R&D spending per person was £21 in the north of England, £14 in the Midlands, £60 in London. That imbalance creates a feedback loop. More R&D, faster business growth, more private investment, even more R&D. London accelerates. Everywhere else slows down. What makes this especially alarming is that Britain's approach is the opposite of what many successful countries do. Germany, for example, channels more support into its poorer regions to bring them up. The UK does the reverse, giving more to the areas already thriving and leaving struggling regions with leftovers. This means businesses outside London are consistently deprioritized. Economic gravity pulls harder toward the capital, and London becomes the only part of the UK fully plugged into the modern global economy. The result is predictable. Britain now revolves around a single city. A once mighty nation with factories that powered the world has shrunk into a country with one dominant economic engine and vast stretches of stagnation. Tony Blair famously said that the kaleidoscope has been shaken and that Britain had a chance to reorder itself before the pieces settled again. But 20 years later, the only thing that's been reordered is the UK's dependency on London. The sad truth? Britain still has the ingredients for success. Talent, history, universities, culture, innovation, they all exist. But until opportunity spreads beyond the capital, those ingredients will never come together. So yes, Britain still has wealth, still has influence, still has global prestige, but almost all of it is concentrated within a few square miles along the Thames. For millions of others, the story is very different. The empire is gone, the factories are gone, and the future feels smaller every year. London dines at Michelin star restaurants. The rest of the UK picks through scraps in the alleyway, like stray cats watching through the glass. Thank you for watching. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe for more deep dives into economics and politics.